The morning train rolled into Caldwell, Kansas, nearly 40 minutes behind schedule, giving the small crowd gathered at the depot far too much time to whisper about the woman who was supposed to arrive. Wade Colter stood beside his weathered wagon with his foreman and several ranch hands, all curious about the stranger sent by the matrimonial bureau. His ranch needed help more than companionship. Since his wife had died 8 months earlier, 6 children had struggled without a mother. Meals had become simple, and the once cheerful home had fallen into silence. Wade expected a strong, older woman ready for hard frontier life and endless responsibility. When the train, her name was Nell Haston, a 31-year-old widow from Boonville, Missouri. She had paid for her own ticket with nearly all the money she owned after losing both her husband and her boarding house job. She had little left besides determination, practical experience, and faith in her ability to work. During the long wagon ride to the ranch, Wade spoke only when necessary while the foreman remained equally quiet. Nell spent the journey studying the wide Kansas prairie and wondering what waited beyond the horizon. She knew every household carried its own sorrows, and every kitchen revealed secrets before people ever spoke. The Colter ranch looked solid from the outside, with gray wooden walls and a broad porch overlooking open grasslands. Inside, however, the kitchen told another story entirely. Dirty pans sat where they did not belong, grease covered the stove, and supplies were scattered carelessly across shelves. It was the kind of disorder created by months of exhaustion instead of laziness. One by one, the children appeared. 4-year-old Will watched her silently from the barn doorway. Thomas and Daniel stayed near the fence. 9-year-old May stood on the porch steps. Clara slept inside, while 14-year-old Ruth arrived later carrying water from the garden. Ruth studied Nell carefully before speaking. "You're the woman from the bureau," she said with little warmth. Nell nodded politely. Ruth explained that her father doubted she would stay because she did not seem like the woman everyone expected. Nell answered gently that she had heard something similar already. Ruth seemed surprised by the calm response, but said nothing else before leaving. Nell immediately lit the stove and searched through the pantry. She found beef neck bones, cracked corn, dried onions, and enough flour for bread. It was not much, but years of boarding house cooking had taught her that ordinary ingredients could still feed hungry hearts. That evening she prepared a simple broth with fresh cornbread and served supper quietly. Wade said a brief prayer before tasting the meal. The younger children ate differently, each revealing something through their plates. Little Will finished every spoonful of soup. Thomas ignored the onions. May preferred bread first. Ruth barely touched her food, slowly moving it around the bowl before asking permission to leave. Wade watched his eldest daughter with deep concern, but said nothing. Nell noticed everything while washing dishes afterward. She understood grief often appeared at the dinner table long before anyone admitted they were hurting inside. The following morning, Mrs. Garrity visited the ranch under the excuse of checking how things were going. Instead, she questioned whether Nell was truly capable of managing such a demanding household. She hinted that perhaps another woman would better suit Wade's needs. Nell simply continued scrubbing the porch rugs while answering politely that she intended to keep working unless Wade himself asked her to leave. Mrs. Garrity departed without another argument, but her visit revealed how little confidence others had placed in Nell. Rather than defending herself with words, Nell decided she would let steady work prove everything that needed proving. The ranch hands were no kinder. Calvin Tate, the oldest cowboy on the property, frequently compared Nell with Wade's late wife and questioned every change she made in the kitchen. He complained about the bread, doubted her cooking methods, and criticized the herbs she arranged neatly beside the stove. Nell refused every invitation to argue. Instead, she rose before sunrise, prepared breakfast, cleaned the house, and patiently earned the trust of the younger children. Will followed her everywhere. Daniel learned simple repairs from her. Thomas quietly helped keep pantry records, and May slowly began smiling again whenever fresh bread filled the kitchen. Only Ruth remained distant, growing thinner with every passing day as she pushed food around her plate without eating. One evening after the children were asleep, Wade found Nell cleaning the kitchen. With tired honesty, he admitted doctors feared Ruth would become dangerously weak if she continued refusing meals. Looking directly at Nell, he confessed that he did not truly need another cook. What he needed was someone who could reach his broken-hearted daughter. Then he gave her only 2 days to succeed. After he left, Nell searched the kitchen shelves and discovered a faded recipe written inside Louise's old hymnal, a forgotten family meal that might hold the key to healing them all. The next morning, Nell rose long before sunrise and quietly returned to the kitchen. The rich broth she had started the night before had simmered for hours, filling the house with a warm, familiar scent. She strained it carefully before mixing flour, rendered fat, a little salt, and the dried sage she had carried from Missouri. Working slowly, she rolled the dough thin and sliced it into narrow strips before dropping them gently into the bubbling broth. The smell spread through every room of the ranch, drawing each child toward the kitchen one by one without anyone calling them to breakfast. Will wandered in first, rubbing his sleepy eyes before smiling at the wonderful smell. Daniel followed, asking what she was making, while Thomas stood silently in the doorway, breathing deeply as if trying to remember something. Eva May lingered beside the stove longer than usual. Finally, Ruth appeared at the kitchen entrance, stopping suddenly as her eyes filled with surprise. She did not speak. Instead, she simply stood there staring at the steaming pot. The fragrance reminded her of happier days when her mother laughed while preparing the very same meal on cold Kansas mornings before gathering everyone around the family table. By noon, the meal was ready. Nell placed bowls around the table exactly as Louise's handwritten recipe suggested, serving the broth first before adding the soft dumplings. Wade entered after finishing work outside and immediately paused. The familiar aroma stopped him in his tracks. For the first time in months, the kitchen smelled exactly as it had when Louisa was alive. He slowly sat down without speaking. The children exchanged uncertain glances before beginning the meal. Nell remained standing beside the stove, quietly watching, hoping the forgotten recipe would awaken memories stronger than grief and stronger than silence itself. Ruth stared into her bowl for several long moments. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the spoon toward her lips. The first taste stopped her completely. Tears gathered in her eyes before she even swallowed. She took another spoonful, then another, eating faster each time. Suddenly, she began crying, not from sadness alone, but from recognition. "Mama made this," she whispered through trembling lips. Every person at the table froze. Wade lowered his head, unable to hide the emotion filling his face. The younger children looked between their father and sister before quietly continuing to eat their own meals. Without warning, Ruth stood from her chair and crossed the kitchen toward Nell. For weeks, she had treated the quiet widow like a stranger who could never belong inside her mother's home. Now she wrapped both arms tightly around Nell and sobbed openly. "I thought I'd forgotten what home smelled like," she whispered. Nell gently held the frightened girl, saying nothing because no words could improve the moment. Sometimes comfort needed silence more than conversation. Around the table, even the ranch hands standing near the doorway quietly removed their hats, recognizing they were witnessing something far greater than an ordinary family supper. That evening, Wade remained in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. He looked at the empty bowls stacked neatly beside the sink before turning toward Nell. His voice was softer than she had ever heard it. He admitted he had judged her the moment she stepped off the train because she seemed too small and too ordinary for such difficult work. Yet no one else had managed to bring peace back into his house. Nell smiled gently and explained that people grieving rarely needed fancy meals. They simply needed something their hearts remembered before sorrow changed everything. The following weeks brought quiet changes across the ranch. Ruth slowly regained her appetite and began helping Nell prepare meals each afternoon. Will stopped following Nell everywhere because he no longer feared she might disappear. Thomas proudly repaired broken shelves around the pantry while Daniel eagerly learned more household skills. May filled empty flower pots on the porch with colorful wildflowers gathered from nearby fields. Even Calvin Tate stopped criticizing the kitchen after tasting Nell's cooking several times. One morning, he awkwardly admitted the biscuits reminded him of his own mother's table, the closest thing to praise the old cowboy ever offered. News of the remarkable changes soon spread beyond the ranch. Mrs. Garrity returned expecting to discover another failure, but instead found laughter echoing through the once silent farmhouse. The children looked healthier, the kitchen sparkled with careful organization, and Wade himself seemed years younger. Embarrassed by her earlier judgment, she quietly apologized to Nell for doubting her abilities. Nell accepted the apology without pride or bitterness. She believed everyone deserved the chance to change their opinion when truth became impossible to ignore. Kindness, she had learned, often accomplished what arguments and pride never could. As spring finally reached the Kansas prairie, Wade realized the woman he had hired as temporary help had become the heart of the ranch. She had never demanded respect, affection, or recognition. Instead, she earned every bit of it through patience, steady work, and quiet compassion. Standing together on the porch one peaceful evening, Wade thanked her for bringing his family back to life. Nell smiled toward the endless prairie, grateful that a forgotten recipe, a warm kitchen, and a gentle heart had led her to a place where she was no longer simply a hired cook. She was finally home,